Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
In her new book, Unrig the Game, What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning, author Vanessa Priya Daniel writes about the challenges that women of color face. The book includes a satirical section that's formatted like a job description. The section details the duties of women of color leaders. Some of those satirical duties include be likable at all costs, work with zero margin of error, and be a willing screen onto which your staff can project the other women authority figures who have ever disappointed them in life. These are just a few of the barriers that women of color in leadership often deal with. And in spite of these barriers, Vanessa argues that women of color are often the drivers of change. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about what we can learn from women of color in leadership. Vanessa Priya Daniel has worked in social justice movements for 25 years. She's principal at Vanessa Daniel Consulting, LLC. Her new book is Unrig the Game, What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. Vanessa, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we talk about this important book that was released earlier this year and the work that you're doing to really get that message out to people, I want to talk about you. I love when our listeners can get a sense of the author behind a work, but also the person who is stepping into that role. You have a long history of being an organizer and someone who has led funding of so many of these efforts and initiatives. What led you onto this pathway of activism and organizing?
Well, I grew up as a queer mixed race kid. I'm half Sri Lankan and half white in Seattle, Washington in the 80s and 90s. This was a time when even in a major city, you could still expect to be rejected by a lot of your friends and family if you came out. It was a time where, for me personally, outside of my immediate family, I had never laid eyes on another Sri Lankan person. I never did, actually, until the time I left at the age of 19. So I grew up feeling like kind of a freak, a nerd, a weirdo who didn't fit in or belong anywhere. And I think that there is a way in which when you grow up feeling on the margins or on the outside of a lot of things, there is a way that you notice how other people are also marginalized. So I did notice like how my mom faced sexism as a single mom trying to get a home loan, trying to run her own business. I noticed how my immigrant family was affected by colonialism, by racism, xenophobia. So I think there's something about social justice work that I think fundamentally is about intervening in the exclusion of people from rights and opportunities based on circumstance that are out of their control, whether it's race or class or gender or sexual orientation or immigrant status, all of these things and like bringing people more into the circle of belonging. And I think that people who have felt that sting of exclusion often have like a deep empathy for that. Like we recognize it in other people, and we sometimes feel this pull to create more belonging in the world. And I do notice a lot of fellow travelers like that in movement spaces that have similar histories. So I think that's what pulled me into the work.
It's a recurring theme for so many people that we talk onto this show about. It wasn't a moment. It for some people wasn't a conscious decision. It was a calling and a recognition of, I am now aware of the ways that I am overlooked or that I have to navigate this world. There have to be other people out there too. And how do we build together the kind of community, the kind of country and world that we want to be part of, and being able to see that as a calling? You mentioned not seeing or knowing many people who shared your identities and experiences growing up. And I have to tell you, Vanessa, for our listeners, there's beauty
Mm.
beautiful artwork behind you on this
Yes.
screen. There are beautiful photos and posters that feel as I am talking to you, noticing this behind you, you are surrounded by these images and connections of power, of leadership, and of purpose. As a young kid who's growing up in a place where, we like nerds on this show because we all are, were there particular women of color who inspired you or people in general who helped you realize you could do whatever you wanted to do as you went through life?
My mother, who's actually a white woman, was a big inspiration for me. She's a second wave feminist. She raised me as a single mom. I watched her move through the world. I watched her start a business. I watched her buy a home for us and go out of her way to help others and kind of buck this notion that you need a man in order to survive in the world. And so, her example as a maverick within her own family and who kind of broke the mold was very influential for me. And then I would say like, Black women were just a huge inspiration and guiding light for me during most of my childhood. My Sri Lankan family was not around in part, because I spoke out about childhood sexual abuse and I was sort of cast out as a result of that. And so, Black women stepped in. They were the ones who taught me how to survive this country as a girl of color. They were the ones who validated that the racism that I was experiencing wasn't just all in my head. They instilled in me this ethic of solidarity with oppressed people. And they were the ones who brought me into social justice movement work. And so from the like historical figures that I learned about, I remember being in second grade and getting assigned a book report. We had to do a book report, and I chose Harriet Tubman. And she's behind me here on the wall, but she was my shiro from that point on.
I think about, as you said, people who showed up in your life at different moments. That example of your mother who said, I can do this regardless of how society thinks that I should be doing this thing called life or raising a child. We are going to do this. And I think about this book, Unrig the Game, What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. And that title resonates so deeply with what you just shared because the ways in which people step forward to say, listen, the game is rigged, but we are going to navigate on our terms. What it means to win will be defined by us. And that act of resistance is very important. Talk to me about the origins of this book and why you chose to write it and release it now.
Well, the time period when I was doing the most work on it was probably between 2020 and 2023, although, I'd done some in the years before. But at that point, I had been working in social justice movements for 30 years from the time I started organizing as a teenager for ethnic studies. So my career had spanned this period of time in which I was fortunate enough, just by sheer luck, to be part of the generation that saw the fruits of the labor of all of our ancestors, movement ancestors, who had pushed for more rights for women of color. And I witnessed the largest ascension of women of color into these top leadership positions in movement organizations across many sectors. Then once I was there, I witnessed the battering that so many of the leaders took. And I saw it from, the perspective of my peers who I was sitting across kitchen tables with, commiserating with during the years I was in ED, about what was keeping us up at night. I witnessed it from the more than 100 grantees that were women of color-led organizations that I funded. As a funder, I saw it, in terms of even during my early years when I was a young organizer, watching how the leaders around me were treated. And then in 2020, I think with the compounding forces of, it's by that point, it's like there had been 4 years of Trump, there had been so many climate disasters, we were going through a global pandemic, just the layer upon layer of pressure. You saw what I witnessed was the things that were already making leadership treacherous for women of color over the years in unique ways. It's like the volume got turned up on all of it. And you started to see this mass exodus. So I remember vividly getting on a Zoom call with some of the top brass women of color leaders across different social justice movements. And these are like tough, seasoned sisters who have delivered over and over again for community for decades. They have gone up against some of the toughest forces of injustice in this country, and seeing so many of them in tears because of the level of attack that they were under from all sides. I'll never forget, it was on that call that somebody said they had just talked to 8 different leaders who said they were resigning their CEO or ED positions, and they would never consider a position like that again. I saw it rip through the more than 100 grantees that I was funding, and how it was destroying leaders and organizations. People were leaving movement in more permanent ways. And so I think that I mean, I had a colleague, another program officer, who saw her portfolio was almost all women of color led groups. 75% of the organizations on her portfolio had leadership turnover in 2021. So, I felt a lot of grief. I was hurting not only for my sisters, people who many of whom were like very, very effective leaders, good, decent people who I had known for years. I was watching them suffer, their health suffer from the hits they were taking. And then I also felt deep grief for our movements, because it's an incalculable loss to lose this caliber of leadership, some of our best and brightest mid-career, with all of their skills, with all of their relationships. And it's just a loss that we can so ill afford in this moment. And the silence around it just absolutely enraged me, that we were having all these conversations in the shadows with each other, leaders were, but there was no conversation in the public square. And then, there was also this element of, I think, just profound irritation at the absurdity of some of the levels of conflict that were happening in organizational spaces at a time when it is so serious outside in the world. And many of us were tracking the rise of authoritarianism at that point, even before we got here, and seeing what was on the horizon. So, some of the absurdity of what women of color leaders were being faced with, and kind of hammered about. I'll never forget someone coming into my office and saying, well, I know I've only been on the job like a couple weeks, but I need a new title because my life coach says that my current one is bad for my brand. It's like, okay, I just spent the morning with, talking to trans leaders who are burying people that were murdered, last weekend. Like, just a misalignment with the seriousness of the moment and how that's being expressed on these leaders. So those were, I think, all reasons why I felt like the book needed to be written.
Coming up, more with Vanessa Priya Daniel, author of Unrig the Game: What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. She'll offer some thoughts on the current political moment.
We are under very little illusion that the way through this moment is to keep our heads down and keep our mouths quiet and follow orders. We are highly motivated to fight.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about women of color in leadership. We're still joined by Vanessa Priya Daniel, a leader with decades of experience in justice movements. Her new book is Unrig the Game: What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. The book draws on Vanessa's experiences and includes dozens of interviews with women of color leaders. It explores the challenges that women of color face and the ways that they are shaping the world. Here's more of our conversation.
Vanessa, I want to be really honest with you. When this book first came across my desk, it took me a moment to open it because I thought, the title alone, your own work and knowing who you are in the space, I knew that there would be hard truths within this book that would be so resonant with my own experience that I thought, is this going to be triggering? Am I going to feel like it is just sort of opening my heart in ways that maybe I'm not prepared for? And there was a bit of that. But more than that, it felt like affirmation and confirmation to say, the thing that people will always tell me is, oh, you just have to have a thicker skin. And the ways that feels very dismissive. And so you acknowledge what women of color who are leaders go through, but you also remind them of what lives within them that is not beholden to title or position or someone else's expectations. You talk about these 3 superpowers that women of color leaders have. What are those superpowers that you discuss?
This piece about the thick skin also, it's like, how often do people tell us to get our thicker skin because they just don't want the inconvenience of letting go of their entitlement to treat us in ways that are rough, So yes. Anyway, I really appreciate you sharing that and saying that. The 3 superpowers that I talk about in the book that came up again and again in these more than 45 interviews that I had the incredible privilege of sitting down and having with everyone from some of our leaders like Dolores Huerta, who co-founded the Farm Workers Union alongside Cesar Chavez, to national leaders like Ashley Woodard Henderson and Linda Sarsour, to electeds like Pramila Jayapal, down to these brilliant young people who were at the time organizing encampments for Gaza. These are the 3 superpowers that again and again rose to the surface. So one is what I call 360-degree vision. And this is the praxis of organizing and strategizing in a way that tackles forces of colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, not just one by one, but in an integrated way. Kimberly Crenshaw talked about the experience of these forces as intersectionality. The Combahee River Collective talked about it. And women of color, like, Sherry Moraga has written about it. When you see organizers, women of color organizers have been about it and fighting not just for race, fair pay, but for racial and gender equity in pay, not just for healthcare, but for gender affirming and reproductive healthcare. It is this insistence on understanding the interlocking forces of oppression that are hurting all of us. And I will say at this particular moment, as we're facing authoritarianism and fascism, that, we have to understand if the space of liberty, if the space of, the hope of democracy in this country is like a house, that so often progressive movements have said, well, we're going to protect the house by closing maybe the front door, dealing with, economic oppression. But then they say we're going to leave these side doors of patriarchy, of transphobia, of homophobia, of xenophobia. We're going to leave these side doors open. Well, let's take a hard look at the doors that fascists just came in, and now they are coming for all of us. And so, this piece of 360 vision is so relevant today. We have to understand that it is no longer, it has never been sufficient, but it's never been more important for us to understand just how insufficient it ever was to talk about the hope of democracy or even the hope of a multiracial democracy. We have to be talking about a multiracial feminist democracy. We have to be integrating our praxis and our understanding. So that's 360-degree vision. The second superpower is boldness. And this is the conviction to fight for the fullness of what our communities need to thrive, of what our planet needs to be livable. And it is such an antidote to this affliction of timidity that fascists use to get all of us to obey in advance. And so we see it in Tish James in New York. We see it in her just doing her job with boldness and diligently, right? She did her job. We see it in the squad as the left flank of Congress. We see it in the stance of an AOC, a Jasmine Crockett, an Ilhan Omar. We see it in the way that we one of the best laws on the books that we have in this country for reproductive freedom is the Reproductive Health Equity Act out of Oregon. It was women of color who sat down at that table and said, when we fight for this, we're actually going to fight for a bill that's inclusive of the rights of undocumented people and trans and gender nonconforming people. And people fought them on that. And they said no, because when we're bolder, we actually bring more people in to the coalition. And that's exactly what happened. That bill, which they had been struggling to pass versions of it for years unsuccessfully, won by a landslide because they didn't just bring in feminists and second wave feminists and people who cared about reproductive rights. They brought in the immigrant rights community. They brought in the LGBTQ community. So there's this way in which working holistically helps us to be able to win and boldly. And then the third piece is generosity. This is the backbone to fight in a way that doesn't throw any group under the bus in order to win. It's saying we are not leaving immigrants or our trans kids or pregnant people or anyone behind. And that kind of stance is absolutely essential to jamming the gears of divide and conquer that authoritarians rely on in order to move their project forward. And we see that in the stance of Fatima Goss Graves, for example, the National Women's Law Center, who said on national TV, the National Women's Law Center will never abandon transgender women. We see this happen. Now these superpowers, they are disproportionately present among women of color leaders, but I think it's really important to say, and this is also part of our humanity, that these aren't innate qualities, right? That not every leader who's a woman of color has them, because Nikki Haley and Candace Owens and certainly people in social justice spaces that are not effective or clear in their politic, and also not everyone who's not a woman of color leader lacks them, but they are disproportionately present because of the forces that we have had to fight and navigate in order to survive. So those are the things that pop the most.
And I'm glad that you mentioned these other examples, because as you talk about that 360 vision, you talk about that generosity, there may be people who say, well, this feels like it is for a particular demographic of women of color based on their political views or their ideological views. And what I read in this book is you making the case for why we actually need to affirm the tremendous diversity that exists amongst women of color leaders, instead of assuming a particular profile, to be able to consider different life experiences, different positioning, and to be able to say, even with all of those differences, women of color leaders are often facing the same challenges, or how quickly women of color as leaders can go from the pet to threat when they say no or stand up for themselves. How do you respond to that claim that this is really about a particular political or ideological worldview that may not be as inclusive of all women of color?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that women of color leaders are in so many ways the MVPs of social change in this country, and that we can look throughout history and see that women of color generally, and Black women in particular, have been the backbone of the major movements of this country throughout time. So when we look at the things that everyone is enjoying, women of color were at the tip of the spear of when you look at something like the Black Panther Breakfast Program. We have millions of children who enjoy free and reduced breakfast and lunch in our nation's public schools. That doesn't happen without the Black Panther Breakfast Program. Some of the greatest wins that we've had, and even though we see the backsliding around it, the IRA, which if we can recover pieces of it at some point, like the largest outlay of resources to address climate change, which is such an existential threat to all of us. It was Breonna Gunn Wright, a Black woman who wrote it. It was AOC, a Latina who co-sponsored it. It was Varshini Prakash, who mobilized young people on the ground to be able to push for its passage. It was women of color at the tip of the arrow saying, we're going to do what's bold and what our communities need and what is required to survive, not just go into the middle of the road milquetoast strategy that we think is going to be palatable. When we even look at the moment we're living in now, I mean, as bad as things are now, and they are bad, can we imagine how much worse it would be if we hadn't had 4 years to have a breath between Trump administrations? That breath was brought to us by Black women organizing voters in tough states like Georgia, by Latinas and Native women in places like Arizona, by like Arab and API, Pacific Islander women in tough states like Michigan. This is who created that margin of victory. So, and we can see the flip is true. When welfare reform was gutted, and let's be clear, it was gutted by Bill Clinton, but the image that was used to drive through welfare reform was the image of the Black welfare queen, even though that is a fraction of the people who are actually on welfare. And when welfare reform was gutted, who numerically is the largest group of individuals who suffered because of it, who couldn't feed their kids because of it, who couldn't afford to go back to school because they didn't have any way to pay their rent because of it? It was white women. It was poor white women. So we have to understand that when women of color are able to fight and advance in a way, it lifts all boats, and also the way in which the image of women of color is used to strip away rights from larger swaths of the population.
Your book was just released in March. It feels that so much has changed in some ways, but your book is also reminding us that this is not new. This precarious situation, the kind of organized attacks and threats are not new. When you think about this current state of U.S. politics that we are in, how does it make you think about the leadership of women of color in these moments?
The United States has definitely experienced fascism in different forms. I think chattel slavery, I think Jim Crow, when we look at these phenomenons, but this is the most bold kind of complete capture of the branches of government that we've seen. And so I do think we need to look globally to understand the wisdom that people around the planet and in the global South in particular understand about how fascism moves and how to address it. I think one thing is true is that fascism, you can go anywhere in the world, it has nearly always been paved with the eroded rights of three groups: racial and ethnic minorities, women, and LGBTQ people. And every single woman of color in this country is a member of at least two of those groups. And those of us who are queer are members of all three. So we are under very little illusion that the way through this moment is to keep our heads down and keep our mouths quiet and follow orders. We are highly motivated to fight. We also know something about how to fight, because what fascism essentially is it's the worst of America, that kind of three-headed monster of patriarchy, white supremacy, and runaway capitalism. And it's that has always existed, but it's that monster on steroids. So it makes sense then that a group of people who have had to battle all three heads of that monster for hundreds of years for our very survival would actually have something to teach America about how to fight. And so I think the wisdom in this book that comes from these tremendous leaders is so applicable now. And it is something that each and every one of us can read, no matter what your background is, no matter what your walk of life. There's something there to take in terms of how to approach the moment that we're in, how to utilize and adopt the superpowers, how to remember that, courage is actually safer than cowardice in this moment. That solidarity is safer than isolating, that using our voices collectively in service of justice actually affords us more protection than our silence. So there's so much of that in the book that has given me hope and energy, and I hope will be instructive for others. And the feedback I'm hearing is that it has been in thinking about ways of approaching the moment we're in.
Coming up, more with Vanessa Priya Daniel. She'll talk about her work in the field of philanthropy.
Gradually over the years, the field of philanthropy has transitioned from being a place where, when I came in, my mentors said, well, be careful standing next to food or holding a baby because they will, ask you for the niçoise salad. They'll assume that you're a server, or they'll assume that you're the nanny.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about women of color in leadership. We're still joined by Vanessa Priya Daniel, a leader with decades of experience in social justice movements. Her new book is Unrig the Game: What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. In the book, Vanessa writes about how people from different generations can learn from each other, including how leaders with lots of experience can learn from younger leaders. She also writes about how tired a lot of women of color are because of all the work that they do without recognition. Asked her to talk more about both topics.
The first question about what are we learning from young people, I think that there's an embarrassment of riches of what young people are giving us right now. And some of the main lessons I've learned is just the push to get out of the culture of martyrdom and overwork that has plagued movements forever, that has eroded our health, and to build workplaces that are more sustainable, to break the gender binary, which of course hurts all of us, including cisgender men, and to be able to free ourselves from the violence of that system, bringing wellness, healing justice into the workplace, which we see a lot of these modalities around somatics and forward stance and Aikido, and just support with emotional regulation coming into the workplace. So, all of these things I think have been wonderful and great. And I think we need to deeply listen and follow the lead of young people in these places. In terms of the exhaustion, I think this is something that we have to unpack, because on the one hand, the exhaustion is real and it's justified. And on the other hand, there can be an overcorrection that occurs when we are making this kind of swing from one extreme to the other. So I'll give you an example, and I kind of refer to it as the overcorrection. That, when I came into movement, for example, we were so focused externally on the work that the internal place was terrible. I mean, when I worked at the union, we were all doing 80 hours a week, and my coworker Ken was sleeping under his desk. It was bad. And now we've some people have really swung to the right, where there's this navel gazing in pursuit of total utopia in the workplace, to the exclusion of excellence in the external work. And this is happening, at every level, like at the staff levels of organization too. And a lot of that expectation is being brought to bear on women of color leaders, of producing a utopia and delivering a utopia, which is, ties in with the demand to mother and mammy, which is very particular to how women of color leaders are treated. So, it is no longer, enough to produce a workplace that's fair and equitable and just, but you have to produce a utopia where no one ever feels a trigger or an ouch or a discomfort, or you're going to be reamed in the public square if you do. If you say no, you're cold and unfeeling. If you are assertive in a way that any other leader would be assertive, you are mean and aggressive. So I think we have to be careful of the overcorrection. We just lost a legend and an icon in our movements, and that's Miss Major, who was just, such a tremendous role model for so many of us. And folks who don't know, Miss Major is just, one of the greatest social justice leaders of all time, but particularly for the LGBT community. It was a, Black trans woman who was President Stonewall, fought for rights during the HIV epidemic, like just an incredible, incredible legacy that she leaves. And I remember being at a conference where a young activist came up to ask her a question and said, well, I'm tired. Like this person, maybe 20 years old, said, I feel so tired. And Miss May just said, well, honey, go take a nap and come back when you feel rested. So I think there's a little bit of a generational thing where you have folks in my generation who have literally worked ourselves into chronic health problems. I mean, I had back surgery in my 30s behind overwork in a way that was really, really unhealthy. And then you have other people who, not necessarily always young, part of also an influx of different kinds of people into movement now that the jobs actually pay well, of people who have a certain level of fragility and a certain level of expectation of utopia. And I think we have to be careful of that, because if we get into a neoliberal mindset where we're actually putting our own comfort at this as the North Star instead of the accountability to the most vulnerable communities, that too becomes a problem. So what I love about the leadership of so many effective women of color is that they are modeling what it looks like to lead with love and to not go they don't want to go back to the good old days, because those days were never good for us, but they are getting killed by this overcorrection that's happening. So they're driving towards a happy medium that means, yes, we have empathy with people, we create sustainable work environments, we bring in modalities like healing justice, we have, good wages and benefits and all that. And we also have some healthy boundaries and limits, because that is also what love looks like. So that means, we are not going to like cater to some of the levels of fragility that are just completely antithetical to what is required of this moment.
I so appreciate you for naming that. The importance of, yes, wholeness and wellness, but also accountability to purpose, accountability to one another, and to realize that if we allow being in leadership to be a hollow prize for women of color, then when we start looking at the pathways into leadership, we understand why so many people either leave the path or never set foot on it because it feels like it has to be all encompassing. I want to bring us back to something you mentioned earlier in the conversation, and that was about the work that you did as a funder. Because that piece of it, Vanessa, is so critical to not just see women of color as the receivers who have need, but trusting their leadership to say, yes, the work you are doing should be funded, and there should be people making those decisions who don't create this feeling of, I need you to come grovel to me for $200 when I know what you are capable of. Talk to me about the transition from, I don't want to say from activist into funder because they are so closely linked, but talk to me about being in that role and why it was so important for you to do that work.
Yeah. I landed in philanthropy almost by accident. I was a, community and labor organizer. And, I had a colleague of mine sent me this fellowship position and said, it's a good way to get a bird's eye perspective on the field. And they had to send it to me a few times because I thought philanthropy is so stuffy. They're going to hate me. I'm going to hate them. And, I got into the role and I realized I had the world's weirdest superpower for kind of bridging between predominantly white affluent donors and folks who had decision-making power in the foundation world and, frontline communities of color in order to move the resources. And, it was important I realized, to have people in these positions who could do that bridging and who could help folks who didn't have any frame of reference with their worldview to understand the incredible wisdom and power that existed at the grassroots. I think that gradually over the years, the field of philanthropy has transitioned from being a place where, when I came in, my mentors said, well, be careful standing next to food or holding a baby because they will, ask you for the niçoise salad, they'll assume that you're a server, or they'll assume that you're the nanny. Nothing, of course, wrong with those professions, but it's like the constant the assumption that you are not actually there as a participant in the space. That has now changed as philanthropy is significantly diversified. I think it's important to note, though, that identity is not the beginning and the end. And as one of my movement elders, Linda Burnham, says, I don't care what color you are, you can be wrong as two left shoes. And what's most important for women of color that are going to the philanthropy space is that they actually have a primary sense of accountability to material change and the empowerment of the most vulnerable communities, and that they understand the power of the grassroots. We've got a philanthropic sector that has been historically more white and more male than corporate America, the higher you get, and that truly believes in a theory of change, that social change happens over martinis and with high power brokers making deals. And we know from social justice history that that is not fundamentally where the greatest changes come from. It is always required organizing. It has always required a mass base. And so we need people, particularly as we understand the data on authoritarianism around the world, that when we look at the work of an Erica Chenoweth, that it takes about 3.4% of a population, when you look at countries around the world, to really be able to shift out of an authoritarian regime, that it is going to require investments in strategies like grassroots organizing. And so I think that it's important to get women of color into philanthropy who have that accountability to communities, but also have an understanding of the breadth of strategies, including organizing, that are going to be so critical to this next period. Because at the end of the day, as important as they are, the courts, even policies, are not the final backstop against fascism. It's always, always the people. And we have to have investments going there to base building and organizing in mass-based organizations. So yeah, it's good. And I will say I'm now a part of collective, the Environmental Justice Resourcing Collective, that's housed at the Katali Foundation, of 7 women of color that all come out of organizing in the worker rights or in the environmental and climate justice space, and who have just finished advising the movement of $75 million to the field. And the way that those dollars moved looks dramatically different from how money is moving in the rest of philanthropy. It's going to general support. It's going to projects that are deeply, deeply about self-determination for our communities, including reparations, including land back to Black and Indigenous communities. It's going to support the integration of movement elders into our work, because they provide such a wise and stabilizing force in our movements and can help guide us. It's going to support sabbaticals to keep our leaders in the work so that they don't burn out. I think just the level of innovation and deep understanding about the needs of our communities is really been apparent. And so that's been a beautiful thing to be a part of. And this group of sisters, they definitely have the experience based on their identity, but they also have the track record in delivering and being accountable to frontline communities.
This is important work, but it's also difficult work. It's complex work. It's nuanced. And I always wonder what gives people hope in the continued possibility. Because it is the kinds of things that you mentioned of being a part of a collective to show how one change, which is, changing the funding structure or changing the barriers to be able to access funding, how that choice can create new pathways and opportunities for so many, and seeing what is possible, that even, yes, things are hard, but there's a commitment and a possibility. As you do this work, Vanessa, what is it that keeps you grounded and hopeful in that possibility for change?
I am inspired every day by the work of frontline grassroots organizations that are organizing in our communities. I am inspired by the ordinary people who have gone outside on bullhorns in the morning to follow ice around and warn their neighbors. I'm inspired by the school teachers who have refused to take down signs that celebrate racial, diversity in their classrooms. I am inspired by everyone who put pressure on Disney to get Jimmy Kimmel back on the air. And let's bring that same fire for Tish James in New York. I am inspired by, the people of Chicago who have really, I think, caused Trump to think twice about moving with the full breadth of militarization that he had planned on in that city. Same thing for Oakland and the Bay Area that just announced that Trump would not be deploying National Guard in those cities as planned. So these are these acts, small acts of resistance and non-compliance, and every single one of us can engage in them in certain ways, depending on our level of risk and time, whether it's going to a protest or doing a civil disobedience, or simply being a government worker who jams the gears by slowing things down. There are a million ways to participate, and as I tour the country and speak to people about this book, I am lifted and inspired about the courage and strength in people's hearts in every town and every city. And I think that's what we have to keep close. And the image I get is walking with a storm through a storm with a candle, holding a candle. And you have to keep the people who inspire you close around you with their candles, because together, that's how we buffer the wind. Together, that's how, when we all have our days of despair, and I know I've had them. I think we've all had them at this point. You don't know what the news cycle is going to bring. When your candle goes out and you feel a moment of despair, you have people around you with enough fight in them, with enough integrity in them, that they're going to relight yours and you can relight theirs. And so that's what's keeping me going at this time.
Well, it is my sincere hope that you, as you continue to do this work, continue to light the candles of others who need that reminder that the power is within us and we can make it possible. Vanessa Priya Daniel is principal at Vanessa Daniel Consulting. Her new book is Unrig the Game: What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Vanessa will be speaking at the Community Fund for Women and Girls 30th Anniversary Celebration in New Haven on November 13th. Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. This episode was also produced by our intern, V. Zhuang. Special thanks to our intern, Tale Ricketson. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. Just search for Disrupted and Connecticut Public. And if you love an episode, please remember to leave us a comment. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.